Hello and welcome to this challenge run of Diablo 2 where I'm only allowed to wear unique items, including charms. I can use a mercenary, but I also have to wear only unique items. But I did cheat the rules a little bit. Since I was live streaming this challenge, I did allow myself to use some Magic Find starter gear to speed up the farming process, to make the stream more eventful. So I added the exception to the rules that I was allowed to wear items that boosted my Magic Find, as long as Magic Find was the only stat available on the item, and I could only use the Magic Find gear until I found my first unique for that slot. I began as a completely naked character, which is another challenge I've tackled recently, so I knew the very first few areas of the aim would be no issue even with just my fists. I decided to pick the druid for this challenge because I wanted a character with the potential of being both a caster and a melee fighter for this challenge, so I could be flexible to whatever cool uniques I would find later, and can even be a summoner if I would end up feeling a little bit lonely. There are a few other classes that also fit the description of both being capable of melee and caster, but I wanted to play a druid this time, and by going for the fire elemental route first, after just a few levels I was going really strong even without a single piece of gear. I did clear out the Den of Evil for the quest reward and save Deckard Cain, but then I went straight for Andariel. I did unlock Fisher right before reaching her, but that meant I was quite underleveled compared to where I usually am at this point. A big part of that was because I skipped the Forgotten Tower and the Countess completely. The low to mid level runes that you find there are super helpful early on, but not for this character, so I didn't bother to clear the tower even once. Before taking on Andariel, I got my first sweet little bit of Magic Find by socketing a chip topaz in a helm. A 9% increase doesn't seem like much, but you have to start somewhere and every bit helps. While the fight wasn't super easy due to low level and no gear, Fisher was able to take her down pretty convincingly, and while I was hoping for an epic drop on the first kill, she didn't deliver. Andariel would be my first farming target to try and get my first unique items. But before I dug in, I went on to Act 2 to shop for some gloves and boots with Magic Find. I didn't want to spend too long refreshing the vendor's inventory since I was trying to entertain a live audience at the same time, so I settled for the first I could come by with a pair of gloves with 9% Magic Find and a pair of boots with 12, putting me at 30% total. Though you can buy both gloves and boots with up to 25% Magic Find in Act 2, so I could have gone a lot higher if I was willing to shop more. Then I headed straight back to Andariel with the intention of farming her for at least a few upgrades before moving on. And on the very first run after the initial kill, I got my first unique drop, a pair of heavy boots. That's Gorefoot, which aren't amazing, especially not for a caster, but they do have some increased movement speed and that was a nice stat to get, though the find was kind of bittersweet since that meant I had to get rid of my Magic Find boots already, removing over 1/3 of my Magic Find. After finding my first unique so quickly, my expectations were quite high, expecting uniques to rain down on me. But that wasn't the case at all. For the next several hours she didn't drop anything, and the runs were kind of slow, so farming her wasn't as efficient as I had hoped. To break up the monotony, I visited Guide to gamble daggers every once in a while. I was hoping for a Gull dagger for that massive 100% increase in Magic Find, but so far no luck. The chance to get a unique is very low, but it was not like I could really use the gold for anything else right now, and I have been lucky before with gambling, so I gave it a shot whenever my gold stash grew to a decent pile and focused solely on daggers for now. I kept on slowly farming Andariel, but apart from some gems and a decent amount of gold, she was not cooperating with me at all. But eventually she did decide to drop another unique, and it got me really excited for a second. I was thinking, or maybe hoping, that it was the Salamander staff with +2 fire skills, but that can actually not even drop from normal Andariel. I coped by telling myself that at least it was objectively an upgrade with the mana and the poison resist, and I did look like a caster now. But so far my Andariel farming had been really disappointing. But happiness is not decided by our circumstances, but how we choose to let those circumstances affect us. And I chose to appreciate the small things, like finding this chip topaz for a slight boost to my Magic Find. At this point both me and my live chat agreed that it was probably better to move on. It's not like Andariel has the best loot pool in normal anyway. And while I hadn't been getting great loot, I had been gaining a lot of experience, which meant that Fisher was starting to get really strong, and that alone could probably carry me through a good part of normal. I did the first quest in Act 2 to get a free skill point for clearing out the sewers underneath the city, and even though the burning skeletons have quite high fire resist for normal, Fisher was completely destroying everything for now. It can struggle a bit against single targets like Radamant, but for now that was more of a speed bump than a challenge. The rest of Act 2 was uneventful, but it started to show that playing the game and trying to talk at the same time while live streaming was a challenge for me. In the dry hills I ran past the entrance to the Halls of the Dead and ended up exploring the full map before noticing. I could give myself a pass on this one though, since it was barely visible on the edge of my explored map, but in the Halls of the Dead, I straight up walked past the stairs to level 3, like right on top of the entrance. I gambled a few more daggers, with nothing to show for it, and eventually made it to Duriel without too much of a challenge. I had actually been wearing both the Staff of Kings and the Claw Viper amulet since finding them, but unfortunately there is as far as I know no way to trick the game into letting you keep them, so I was back to my Serpent Lord staff and no amulet. The Duriel fight was a mess, and I'm going to blame the mental fatigue I experienced from streaming. I forgot to buy thawing potions, I didn't restock my health potions, and I was not doing a great job of healing my mercenary or setting up new town portals in time. But the druid also has really bad recovery frames, and in combination with Duriel slow, it felt like I was playing in slow motion while my character got stuck on pebbles on the ground while a giant bug chased after me. I must confess to dying several times here, showing my live audience exactly why I don't do my challenge runs in hardcore. But eventually I was able to defeat Duriel, who unfortunately didn't drop any uniques. Farming Duriel didn't seem like a great idea, so I moved on to Act 3, which was a similar story to Act 2. I was mostly interested in making it through the act as quickly as possible, potentially looking to farm Mephisto for some gear. Casting Fissure and running in circles made short work of any enemies, and I really started to appreciate the faster run walk from Gorefoot. When it first dropped, it really felt like whatever, but as time went on, I was really happy to have the extra movement speed, despite the game being easy at this point, or maybe because of that, lowering my guard. I managed to die to the super unique bat boss in the sewers when looking for the last of Kalim's organs. But when I went to recover my body, I was surprised by another unique. It must have dropped by something dying right as I died. Crush Flange might look like a melee weapon with a crushing blow, but the extra strength and the massive boost to fire resist are good stats for any character, and definitely better than the staff I was currently wearing. I originally had my eyes set on normal Mephisto as my next farming target, but my live viewers convinced me that it was probably a better idea to try and push for Nightmare and Dariel for the next big farming session, so I rushed through the rest of Act 3 and Act 4, killing minimal enemies and not finding anything. I failed to get any topazes from the Hellforge and put 2 flawed and a normal topaz in the breastplate. And before moving on, I also upgraded my Magic Find gear by going back to Act 2 normal to shop for a new pair of gloves with higher Magic Find. Those 2 upgrades got my Magic Find up to 82%, which isn't anything crazy, but certainly a nice boost. I then progressed through Act 5 and again the fire spells were carrying me hard even though my gear was a big mess. I kept gambling my gold away throughout the challenge, and now I started going for heavy belts instead of daggers. The lack of additional potion slots without a belt were starting to really annoy me, and if I would manage to get a unique, a heavy belt would be gold wrap, which has a decent amount of magic find as well. But again, no luck with gambling for uniques, and it was kind of painful to get some pretty sweet rares that I could not use, like belts with resist, stats, faster hit recovery and life. It had been a long time since I found any uniques at this point, and as I was getting closer to Bale, me and my live chat started to fantasize about what drops I could get next. Top of mind were uniques that would give me even more magic find, like the Gull Dagger, Gold Wrap or even Tarnhelm. The fire spells dealt great damage, but my character was a little flimsy. So we were also talking about some nice resistance boosting uniques like the Skin of the Viper Magi, the Ward or even Moser's Blessed Circle. Soon enough I defeated Bale, and he did end up dropping the first really good item for this challenge, a unique Gothic shield, which is the previously mentioned the Ward. This was of course a really hype moment during the live stream since we had just been talking about it, but it's also a really solid item, especially with a great roll like this, scoring a 47 out of 50 on the all resistances roll. In my eyes this was definitely a potential endgame shield for the character, so I immediately went to Larsek to give it a socket and put a perfect diamond in it for even more resistances. Plus 66 to all resistances from a single item. That was enough to put me all the way up to the cap of 75 on every resist with a little help from the quest reward from saving Anya. I had been considering doing some Bale runs in normal, but with this drop I was now more than confident to get started in Nightmare, heading straight for Andariel for our next farming session, stopping only to do the Den of Evil quest for the free skill point and saving Cain from Tristram. And while saving Cain, something pretty cool happened. Getting a perfect pattern on the stones must be a good omen, right? Entering Nightmare did in some ways mark the real beginning of the challenge, because now some of the really good uniques could start dropping. On the very first Andariel kill, she dropped another unique shield. Storm Chaser has some pretty unique stats, but it didn't seem too useful to me, and I couldn't even lump it on my mercenary because he wasn't high enough level yet. I ran Andariel for the next several hours. It wasn't very efficient, partially because he was kind of dangerous at my current level and partially because I was streaming. And after that first kill she was also not very generous with her drops. I did eventually find a flawless topaz, which ended up being the slightest of upgrades in my magic find armor, pushing my MF another 2% to 84 in total. I had spent almost 2 hours at 30's point without much to show for it. Though when a flawless gem makes the highlight reel, you know the dry streak in drops was bad, but then it was finally time for another good unique. I was wasting a lot of enough gold resurrecting my mercenary without much of a plan behind it because he kept dying, so I decided to stop doing that and instead went for another round of gambling at Geats, again hoping to score a belt for more potion slots. I gambled over 200,000 gold this time, but no unique heavy belts. However, on the very next run, still in the same game as I did the gambling, Diablo 2 RNG decided to show his funny side. This was another really awesome drop, partially because of the hype of finding an item I was trying to gamble for, but it was also a really good item for me at this point, blessing me with the additional potion slots that I had been craving ever since the challenge started, and also pushing my magic find past 100, all the way up to 114. This also marked a bit of a milestone because now I was wearing as many unique items as I was wearing my MF cheater, MF starter items. And now with even more magic find I would surely speed up the progress of gearing my druid in all uniques. But it turned out that some of the progress that followed the lucky gold wrap wasn't all that great actually. I'm skipping over some of the non-impactful stuff like your blood rises and your skull splitters, but eventually I find my first unique body armor. And this was my live reaction. Ooh, I got... No! No! This is Rattle Cage, right? Really good armor, but that means we lose some magic find. It was another gear slot filled with a unique item, but the excitement quickly went away as I realized that this would cause me to lose a big chunk of my magic find. And this particular armor was not really giving me any benefits as a caster either. There was a silver lining in that this could be a pretty decent mercenary armor later on, but I would need to find another unique armor for myself before that was even an option. Magic find down from 114 to 72. That hurt. Soon after I did find a flawed topaz, which helped a little bit by bringing my magic find back up to 85, but before I even remembered to update my overlay to reflect this upgrade, the game decided to take it all away by dropping my first unique helm just a couple of runs later. Now, Dusk Deep isn't a terrible helm, it does give 15 to all resistances and 7 damage reduction, which are actually pretty useful stats, but it was really hard for me to appreciate that in the moment as it knocked my magic find all the way down to 52. I knew this was going to happen eventually as I found more uniques, but these 2 drops alone took away over half of my magic find within the course of an hour, which was rough as I was in full-on farming mode. And not only that, the armor and the helm all of a sudden transformed my druid into a barbarian lookalike. Despite losing over half of my magic find, I kept running Andariel for several more hours. I scored Alder's Mace from the Elite Druid set, but that was of course not usable since it's not unique. Between streams I re-rolled my map for a shorter run to Andariel off camera, and unfortunately I found a unique while doing so. I had been starting to dream of a respec to a melee druid to spice up the challenge, and this Bone Snap could definitely have been a solid option for that, but it didn't feel right to sneak a unique I found off camera into the challenge, so I donated it to Charcy. Though shortly after I did find another nice melee weapon with this unique Gladius. Bloodletter looks like a barbarian item with a plus to skills, but it has some really nice stats for any melee class. Attack speed, damage, lifesteal and even attack rating. Though that alone was definitely not enough to persuade me into a respec. Just a couple of runs later I found another good melee weapon, but this time it was not for a potential future werewolf but for a mercenary. Kelpie Snare has decent damage for sure, but more importantly 75% slow on hit. It was also the very first unique spear or polearm that I found at all, which sort of unlocked the Act 2 mercenary for me. And I knew this was a pretty good drop when it happened, but I did not yet realize just how impactful this single item would be for the remainder of the run. The slow would end up being a huge help against Act bosses and difficult elites alike, but you'll see more of that a bit later into the game. I was really on a roll now, and just a short while later I found more weapons, and this time it was something actually great for my current build. And it was not from Andariel, but from a random monster in the room before hers. The Dark Clan Crusher, my first plus 2 skills from gear, and 2 of them on the same item. A really great find. Doesn't have any FCR, which is usually important for casters, but on the Fire Druid it's not as important, since all of the fire spells have a short delay between casts anyway. Then more loot from the room before Andariel, and this time it was another piece of body armor with a unique ring mail. Darkglow was not on the top of my wishlist, but it does have plus 10 to all resistances, which was a decent boost, and more importantly it would allow me to put a Rattle Cage on my mercenary for that sweet crushing blow, which would pair so well with his quick jab attacks. The next drop was a roller coaster of emotions. Andariel dropped an axe, and seeing it was ethereal I defaulted to thinking it was the Ethereal Edge, which is always ethereal, but that's actually both a different kind of axe and also the elite version. Anyway, I quickly forgot about the ethereal part once I identified it and was super happy to see spell steal. I was not expecting to have access to teleport charges on a unique only run, and the curse charges could be useful too. This could really speed up my runs and help in dangerous situations. But then I remembered, it was ethereal, which meant that the charges couldn't be replenished. That was quite unfortunate, but I did end up carrying it with me because if nothing else it would still be good for 12 teleports, which could maybe matter in the future. future. The final noteworthy item I found was the Venom Ward. Would have been useful to find this earlier as it would have been quite good to use against Andariel specifically, but it was still a decent find as it could be a good utility armor for the future and maybe a good mercenary armor if I would end up farming Andariel in Hell 2. I had been getting a lot of gear upgrades from Andariel, filling out most of my gear slots and scoring some decent items in the process. But not only that, I'll also gain an additional 15 levels while farming her. All of this combined had doubled my fissure damage compared to when I started Nightmare and had given me a decent boost to my life pool too, so it will probably not come as a surprise when I tell you that the rest of Nightmare was not much of a challenge. I rushed the mandatory quest as fast as possible with my eyes set on my next magic find target. I found no uniques worth talking about while questing, but in Act 3 I did end up upgrading my magic find in a significant way. I got my first usable charm with this lucky large charm, which I allowed myself to use under my starting MF gear rules exception. But that was not really the significant part, because from the same loot haul I finally got my first magic find ring. It seemed kind of unlucky to me that this was the first MF ring I had found in the entire challenge, but regardless I was very happy to see this, and 24 is a really good roll for a magic ring. Those two items boosted my total magic find from a mediocre 52 all the way to a mediocre, but still better, 77. And the extra magic find came at a really good time because I was just about to face Mephisto, and you can already see how useful the slow from Kelpie Snare was going to be, basically putting Mephisto in slow motion and drastically decreasing the amount of spells he spams. After I defeated Mephisto, it was once again time to trade a big chunk of my magic fund for a useless unique, because these gloves really didn't offer me much as a caster. I guess at least I was able to keep over 50% MF thanks to my newly found ring. Always look on the bright side, right? I was debating between farming Nightmare Mephisto for a while or rushing towards Hell as fast as possible. I stuck around for a little while, but with the intent to move on soon and not stick around for nearly as long as I did with Andariel. An hour came and went without me getting any new interesting uniques at all, but finally my decision paid off when I found the second unique hat of the run. The Peasant Crown, or Baby Shaco as some call it. Well, it's far from a Shaco, but +1 skills, faster running and a big boost to both vitality and energy. A very nice helm for this druid indeed, and my mercenary would certainly enjoy my old Dusk Deep as well. Mephisto also gave me another bone snap and I caught it on camera this time, and this one rolled really high as well, with 289 out of 300 max on the ED. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but I did end up upgrading my gold rep to a battle belt to get one additional roll of quick slots for my potions. It required me to invest a little bit extra strength, but I do value convenience very highly. A few of my live viewers were wondering why I didn't include set items in this challenge, and I didn't really have a strong reason other than keeping things simple and straightforward, but I was definitely sticking to uniques only, and so far it had not mattered much. But then I found a green winged helm. G-Face would have been a great mercenary helm, or even something to wear as a werewolf if I decided to respec to melee later. This was the first set item that actually hurt a bit to find, even so much that I put it in my stash even though I was never going to be able to use it. Apart from the Peasant Crown, which was a great drop, don't get me wrong, my Mephisto farming quest had not been fruitful, so after a few hours I moved on to finish off the rest of Nightmare to get a bit of progress in and to open up more farming options. And to be fair, it was not really like this character needed more gear or levels right now. Just look how easily I was able to take down Isuo. The Nightmare Hellforge had a nice surprise for me, a Pull rune. This was kind of significant because if I could only find a Lam rune, I would be able to upgrade an exceptional unique weapon to Elite, which could end up being a big deal for my mercenary. And once again I want to highlight just how awesome the slow from Kelpie Snare was, both against Lister and Bale himself, truly one of the MVPs of this run. I stuck around to farm Nightmare Bale a few extra times and set the goal for myself to find at least one unique before moving on. And well, that ended up taking 2 whole hours before I found a single unique item from him. In hindsight, that ended up not being the worst thing that could happen, because it gave me a lot of extra levels, which came in handy later as I entered Hell. But what a grind! And the unique that finally dropped was just a Blood Thief, but this drop was more about the freedom to finally move on. And the extra levels made a big difference. My fire spells took care of both normal and elite enemies easily, and I had an army of allies to keep me safe as well. So I rushed for Andariel as fast as possible, without much happening along the way. That was until the Catacombs level 1, where I found my first unique ring in a casket. The ring turned out to be a Dwarf Star, and when I'm doing my big magic find projects, this ring usually disappoints, but this time it was quite a nice find. The 15% fire absorb and the 12 magic damage reduction and some life. Quite good for defensive stat. And 100% extra gold find was quite nice because I wasted so much gold on this run on gambling from Geed. I continued on to Andariel, and despite the fire immune monsters who spawned there being quite annoying, I soon cleared out the first room, and I'm not exactly sure what I was so scared about with my high level of fire skills, but I decided to cheese Andariel with the door trick, which, in case you didn't know, is that you can grab Andariel's attention and then run back to the first room while closing the door behind you, and then you can kill her through the door if you have any sort of skill with splash or area damage. I wanted to farm Andariel, but I was a little scared. Again, in hindsight, that didn't make much sense. So instead I continued questing, but after having made it through most of Act 2 without anything interesting happening, someone in my stream chat informed me that Andariel was terrorized. That seemed like a great opportunity to go back and farm Andariel in Nightmare, and that turned out to be a very rewarding decision. The first notable find was another great set helm for the mercenary, which of course he couldn't use. Currently lacking any form of lifesteal, Talrasha's mask would have been absolutely great for him, and shortly after I found a unique cleaver. It turned out to be a quite good roll, and while Butcher's Pupil might not be the best melee weapon in the game, it's definitely good enough to beat the game with, and being indestructible is a really nice addition to avoid having to repair your weapon all the time. But then it was time for the drop I teased earlier. At the tail end of the hour of Terrorized Andariel, I found an item I could only have dreamt about finding in a unique only run, the Harlequin Crest aka Shaco. This was one of the absolute best items I could have found for this challenge. 2 skills, life, mana, damage reduction, and even a big chunk of magic find to help me find even more uniques. Definitely one of the highlights of this entire playthrough. I immediately went to Larsuk to socket it, and didn't even question how a blacksmith made a socket into a flimsy textile shroud. I put a perfect topaz in the socket, which put a big smile on my face and updated my current MF to a new record high. What a great moment for the character and the challenge. I then finished up the rest of Andariel's terrorized hour without finding anything, before heading back to Hell Act 2 and finished up the questline at Duriel's expense. At this point I definitely did not need to farm more items or levels, but before going to Act 3 I went back to Act 1 to farm Hell Andariel anyway. I found a pair of unique Demonhide boots, which are Inferno Stride. They give faster run walk and decent fire resist, and it's also found to randomly cast Blaze, and since my old boots offered only 20% faster run walk, it was an easy upgrade. On the next run I found an item that I would absolutely have loved to find earlier on in this challenge. Tarnhelm is a great helm with the extra skill point, extra gold find and increased magic find, but of course not when compared to my Shaco. Did I mention that I found a Shaco yet? I feel like I didn't talk enough about it. My Inferno Strides didn't last very long, because next I found another pair of unique boots. As much as I enjoyed running around with Blaze active, the stats of Tearhaunch and 10% to all resistances in particular just slightly outweighed the stats of Inferno Stride. I also found the armor Black Hades in the same drop, which I later ended up using on my mercenary, with the good stat being the 3 open sockets to help shore up his resistances with runes. And before finally moving on, I also found another unique breastplate, and this time it was ethereal. In the moment I was quite excited to find this, since ethereal items are good for mercenaries, but in hindsight the ethereal bonus wasn't doing that much for us since the base damage of the breastplate is so low anyway. Well, now at least I had 2 of them if I for some reason wanted to put one on me and one on my mercenary at the same time in the future. I think I was getting a bit bored being a fire mage at this point, because out of nowhere I decided to respec to a werewolf, despite not really having found any truly great melee items. I used the Butcher's Pupil from earlier and also carried the Bone Snap on Switch, with most of my other gear remaining the same. And while questing through the jungle of Act 3, the build worked fine, I guess, but with a huge caveat of only as long as my army stayed alive, because while I could dish out damage at a decent speed, as soon as more than a few enemies started targeting me, I quickly folded, and that's with over 40% lifesteal from Feral Rage. I painstakingly stuck with the werewolf for a while since I didn't want to change my build back right away during a livestream, and I did make it through most of Act 3. But then Andariel got terrorized again, and the werewolf proved to not be the best boss killer despite 45% crushing blow, so I ended up respecing again, and this time to a wind druid. Now it might seem like the video is derailing a bit and going all over the place, and that's exactly what happened during the challenge. There are still some cool drops coming, and I hadn't beaten the most difficult parts of Hell yet, but in hindsight I ended up spinning my wheels a fair amount at the tail end of this challenge, so I'll try to gloss over the hours of grinding I did and focus on progress through the last acts of Hell and some of the best drops only. But the Wind Druid spec was actually surprisingly good. I had not played one in a long time before this, and I assumed it would be underwhelming with literally 0% faster cast rate, but the tornado tornadoes dealt great damage anyway, and hurricane was a great supporting skill. The wind druid also gets access to cyclone armor, which absorbs all elemental damage except poison, so now my elemental defenses were more than sorted, and I could even wear one of my venom wards to shore up my weakness to poison. But going back to Andariel again did pay out when she dropped his Crown of Thieves, which gave my mercenary some much needed lifesteal, as well as a pair of Frostburn gloves which I equipped for the extra mana, and also my second charm of the round, a lucky grand charm to push my magic find a little further. Before going back to questing, I decided to reward my mercenary Galsar for his loyal services by upgrading his spear from a Fushina to a Stygian pike with the Palrune from the Nightmare Hellforge, massively increasing his damage output. Back in Act 3 Hell, progress was super smooth. The Wind Druid was day and night compared to the Werewolf, so I quickly found myself at Mephisto. After defeating him, I was ready to head on to Act 4 Hell and take on Diablo for the last time, but instead I decided to go back and do some more farming. Again. This time at Hell Mephisto, and while I did get some decent drops like Valkyrie Wing and Ethereal Rock Fleece and Gladiator's Bane, there was not much exciting coming out of this grinding session. Until one run, when I found an upgrade so good that I finally stopped farming. Mephisto dropped a unique bone knife, which is Wizard Spike, a dagger with a huge boost to all resistances, some decent mana, but most importantly a massive 50% faster cast rate. I lost out on 2 skills from the Druid Club, but 50% FCR meant that I would cast Tornado once every 13 frames instead of once every 18 frames, which was a very big increase to my damage output. So then I finally decided to move on and try to finish Hell, and at this point I was so strong that it didn't feel like a challenge run anymore, which isn't that unexpected I guess, or to quote one of my live viewers, "Wow, it turns out that if you farm for 7 days you get good gear, who would have known?" Diablo never knew what hit him, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but the slow on Kelpie Snare is so good. Just look at how hopeless Diablo looks, operating at 25% speed, and with the momentum from the Diablo fight I made quick progress through Act 5, and before taking on the final roadblocks of Hell, here's what my gear looked like prior to taking on the Ancients. My latest find, Wizard Spike, the ward, which had served me so well ever since normal Bale dropped it for me. Harlequin Crest Shaco, 10 out of 10 item, no notes. Hawkmail, one of the weaker uniques I was still wearing, but some extra run speed and cannot be frozen were some nice comfort stats to have. And I used to wear Venom Ward earlier to help with my poison resist since Cyclone Armor only absorbs fire, cold and lightning, but I didn't need that anymore after finding the Wizard Spike. Frostburn Gauntlets, I wish they were Mage Fist, but they were alright. Big mana increase. Manald Heal, small stats, but at least it was a unique. And while recording the commentary for this video, I realized that I forgot to include this drop, but unfortunately I don't remember where I found it anymore. Sorry. The upgraded gold wrap, which never left my waist ever since I first found it. My second ring was the Dwarf Star, and finally, Tearhaunch. Galsar was wearing the Crown of Thieves for 10% lifesteal, the Black Hades socketed with an Ort, a Thal and a Sol Rune for some resistances and physical damage reduction, and of course the upgraded Kelpie Snare. I actually think this was the most impactful item I found in the entire run. Sure, Shaco and Wizard Spike are amazing items, but Kelpie Snare helped me so much against bosses during the entire challenge, especially earlier on when I was a little bit weaker, allowing me to farm act bosses much more safely. But this is the last time I'm praising Kelpie Snare, I promise. We took on the Ancients in the area at Summit, and I took my time to separate them from each other, but in hindsight I'm not even sure if that was necessary, because they ended up being both easy and pretty quick to kill. I did run into some dangerous elite enemies in the Worldstone Keep and the Throne of Destruction, but the worst they could do was destroy my summoned and occasionally also my mercenary. I was never in any real danger and soon I made it through the throne. But overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer, and my ignorance let Lister and his pack take me down once. This was 100% on me and a completely avoidable death, but the game did humble me one final time before the finish line. After this I sharpened up, took down Lister's gang and went down to face Bale. This was a super fun challenge that I really enjoyed, especially the first half. I got a little carried away with the loot grinding towards the end, but all in all a great challenge that I might even revisit again in the future. And in the end I did end up filling every equipment slot with only uniques, if you count the short period of time that I wore the Amulet of the Viper before using it as a quest item in Act 2, and I do. And just over a minute after the fight started, Bale was defeated and the challenge completed. A special thanks to Kelpie Snare for making this video possible, and also a big thanks to all channel members for your support.